Female vet rescues mud-covered, weak bobcat cub. The moment she washes it, she screams, "Call 911." It began with a scream. Not the kind that comes from a storm or an injured animal, this one cut through the drenched stillness like a blade through canvas. The kind that makes people stop breathing for a moment because it carries something heavier than fear. Northern Montana. Late spring, 2023. A season when the rivers should have been running clear, when the cottonwoods along the valley floor should have been greening for summer. But that year, the rains didn't stop. For 12 straight days, the sky opened like it had a grudge, turning creeks into rivers, rivers into walls of water that moved barns off foundations and carved new scars into the land. When it finally ended, the mud remained, dark, sucking, knee-deep in places where homes once stood. The rescue teams had already moved through for survivors, the county had begun its tally of losses, and the people of Fort Benton tried to return to whatever was left of normal life. But storms never leave only debris. 3 days after the last helicopter pulled away, a ranch hand on the north edge of the valley found a sound where there shouldn't have been one, a thin, broken cry coming from a tangle of driftwood and weeds shoved against the fence line. When he pushed through with his boots, he found something so small and soaked through he thought at first it was already dead. It wasn't. The call went out to the one person in Choteau County everyone knew would come. Dr. Maren Hayes, 41, former Denver Zoo wildlife vet, 15 years treating everything from owls with shattered wings to deer tangled in barbed wire. She ran the only private wildlife clinic within 100 miles. People said she had the kind of steady hands that made animals trust her before they should have, the kind of patience that didn't break even at 3 in the morning with a mountain lion on the table. When the ranch hand showed up at her door carrying the bundle wrapped in a feed sack, she didn't ask questions. She just opened the clinic, set down her coffee, and cleared the exam table. Inside that sack, a bobcat cub, maybe 6 weeks old, little more than ribs and shivers under the mud. By the time she slid the tiny body under the heat lamp and started fluids through a line no thicker than a thread, the rain outside had stopped for good. But the storm wasn't over. Not really. Because as Maren worked, washing away the layers of silt and clay so infection wouldn't take what the flood hadn't, something new came into view beneath the dirt-caked fur. Something that shouldn't have been there. A strip of leather, cut tight around the fragile neck. And on it, a metal tag stamped with numbers no rancher in Montana would recognize. Not a collar from a pet. Not anything issued by Wildlife Services. And here's the part that made her stop with the scissors halfway closed. The skin beneath the strap was rubbed raw like the animal had been wearing it for weeks. Maybe longer. So why had no one seen it before? Why was a wild bobcat carrying a man-made tag through a valley flood miles from any road? And most of all, what were they supposed to do now that the tag was in her hands instead of whoever put it there? Dr. Maren Hayes didn't say anything. Not yet. But by the time the cub's heartbeat steadied under the heat lamp, the questions had already started stacking like storm clouds behind her eyes. Because storms don't just wash through towns. Sometimes, they wash things out. And sometimes, what they wash out changes everything. The rain had left everything heavy. Branches bent under the weight of water, fences sagged where the current had pushed debris into their wire. But inside the clinic, the air held only one sound, the slow, even beeping of the monitor beside the exam table. The cub lay beneath the heat lamp, sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. Fur still damp but clean now, the faintest trace of its natural tawny color beginning to return where mud had stripped it away. Maren watched in silence. She'd seen animals arrive half-dead before, eagles from power lines, coyotes with leg-hold trap wounds, deer hit on frozen highways. But this was different. The storm might have delivered the cub, but the collar, that carried human weight. She set the tag down under the fluorescent light again. 4 numbers. A dash. 2 more. Like a code or an inventory mark. Wildlife tags existed, sure. But Montana used microchips now, not leather straps that cut into the skin like this one had. The cub stirred weakly, a soft whimper leaving its throat. The sound pulled her back to the moment. Whatever questions that tag carried could wait. The life in front of her couldn't. She moved with practiced calm, checking vitals, warming fluids, coaxing the smallest trickle of diluted formula into the tiny mouth. At first the cub resisted, then swallowed, eyes still half shut but clinging to the warmth in her hands. That was the first twist, the one she didn't see coming. Because somewhere between floodwater and fever, this wild, half-drowned creature began watching her with the same focus she used on it. Not panic. Not confusion. Something quieter. Like it understood in its own way that the hands moving carefully over its ribs weren't here to take, only to give back what the storm had tried to erase. By nightfall, the cub could lift its head. Only for seconds, trembling under the effort, but enough to meet her eyes once before dropping back to sleep. And with that look came the second twist, small, silent, but sharp enough to stay with her long after she turned off the clinic lights. Because animals didn't look at humans like that unless something in them had already learned too much about people. She wrote the thought down in the logbook without even meaning to. Acts tame. Watches everything. Not normal behavior. Outside, the highway crews cleared mud from the main road. Reporters packed up, chasing the next disaster. But inside the clinic, the mystery began to grow roots. By morning, the cub was stronger. Moving a little, testing its legs inside the pen she'd lined with towels. Eating small amounts on its own now. But every time she stepped away, its eyes followed. Not like a lost baby calling for a mother. Like something waiting. She ran the tag number through every database she could access, USDA, Fish and Wildlife, even state livestock records. Nothing. The leather smelled faintly of oil and dust when it dried on the counter overnight. A smell she couldn't place at first. Not ranch work. Not hunting gear either. Something else. By the third day, the cub began exploring the edges of the enclosure, limping slightly where the collar wounds still healed. It climbed once, awkwardly, to the top of the overturned crate inside, watching the door with unnerving stillness. Marin noticed it most when she cleaned the pen. Each time she reached in, the cub moved back just enough to stay out of reach, but never hid. Never bared teeth. Never made a sound. It simply watched. Like it had learned the world wasn't safe but hadn't yet decided which part of it she belonged to. That night, as wind rattled the loose pane in the clinic's back window, she sat with the tag under the lamp again. 4 numbers. A dash. 2 more. Not random. Never random. The cub slept behind her, breath steady now, the tiny chest rising and falling under the blanket she'd left in the corner. But the question pressed harder with each hour. Who puts a collar on a bobcat this young? And why leave it miles from the nearest road to drown in a flood? When the call finally came 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy asking if she'd seen anything strange after the storm, she didn't mention the tag right away. Because she already knew this was bigger than a lost animal. And because deep down, a part of her feared the answer was going to change more than just one rescue. By the 4th day, the cub had stopped trembling. It moved through the small enclosure with the kind of restless energy that told Marin 2 things at once: it was healing, and it wasn't meant to be here. Bobcats this young usually hid, cried, or lashed out. This one did none of that. It watched. Always watched. Like it had lived long enough already to learn something wild animals shouldn't know about people. That was the first twist. Because animals this age didn't carry wariness like an old wound. Marin stood at the exam table that night with the tag under the harsh clinic light. She had run it through every database she could reach: hunting clubs, wildlife sanctuaries, research programs. No record. No match. The numbers stared back at her like a locked door. And behind her, in the faint lamplight of the enclosure, 2 golden eyes blinked once, unafraid. She turned slowly. The cub hadn't made a sound in 2 hours. But now it stood at the edge of the pen, shoulders low, ears forward, the kind of posture wild animals use when they know something before you do. That was the second twist, not loud, not sudden. Just that quiet wait in the air when instinct sharpens before the mind catches up. She crouched to meet its gaze. Nothing moved. Not the cub. Not her. Not the air in the room. She didn't name animals she planned to release. Names softened edges that shouldn't be softened. But in her logbook she wrote Case 47B because she needed something to call it. Case 47B watched her the way animals in traps watched their surroundings, like freedom was still an option but not a promise. The deputy came the next morning. Big man, tired eyes, uniform still streaked with dried mud from flood rescues. He asked about the tag, about the cub, about whether she'd seen anyone up in the North Hills before the storm hit. She told him no one had been around. Which was true. He wrote notes slowly, like he was thinking about something bigger than lost animals. Then he looked at the cub and said, almost to himself. Funny thing, third call this week about animals turning up where they shouldn't. She didn't ask what he meant. He didn't explain. When he left, the wind pushed the door closed behind him harder than usual. By evening, Marin found herself watching the cub longer than she meant to. It moved well now, testing its legs along the pen's edge, climbing the overturned crate with more confidence each time. But what struck her wasn't the movement. It was the way it always paused at the window. Not curious. Not playful. Like it remembered something out there it couldn't reach anymore. She wrote it down without thinking. Keeps facing north. Every time. On the 6th day, she drove out to the hills where the ranch hand had found it. The flood had left the land unrecognizable, new channels carved through wheat fields, barbed wire tangled in trees like spider silk. At the edge of a gully where the water had cut deepest, she found tire tracks half buried in silt. Too small for ranch trucks. Too recent to be from before the storm. The mud held their shape the way floods sometimes preserve things, sealing them in time for anyone who knew how to look. 2 sets. In. Out. She followed them until the road climbed toward the tree line. That's where they stopped. Turned around. No reason to come this far unless you had something to leave behind. She stood there a long time, wind moving through the blackened cottonwoods, listening for something she couldn't name. When she got back to the clinic, the cub was waiting at the edge of the pen, ears forward, body still. The deputy called again that night. Said a second animal had been found after the storm, a coyote, young, starved, wearing the same kind of collar. Marin looked at the tag on her desk, the cut leather edges curling as they dried. 2 animals. 2 collars. Not random. Never random. And for the first time since the storm ended, she felt the ground shift under this story the way it had under the flood. Because collars meant ownership. And ownership meant someone, somewhere, was already missing what the storm had taken away. By the end of the week, the storm felt like old news to everyone except Marin and the cub. The town had moved on. Roads reopened. Power lines repaired. Families gutted their homes and laid out carpets to dry in the pale spring sun. But in the clinic, the air stayed thick, like it carried something no wind could clear. Case 47B, she still called it that in her notes, though the name felt clinical against the way it watched her now, had grown steadier on its legs. Eating on its own. Stretching in the small patch of sunlight that cut across the enclosure floor each morning. But every so often, it froze. Head up. Ears forward. Body turned toward the door like it was waiting for something that never came. That was the first twist. Because wild animals didn't wait for doors to open unless somewhere, sometime, one already had. On the 8th day, the deputy returned. This time he carried photographs in a folder still damp at the edges. 2 coyotes. 1 fox. All wearing collars cut from the same kind of leather. All found in the last 5 days, scattered across the county like coins dropped along a trail. None tagged by any official program. He left the folder on her desk, said they were checking with Fish and Wildlife, and walked out like a man carrying too many questions already. Marin didn't move for a long time after the door shut. The cub lay curled in the corner of the pen, tail tight around its body, eyes half closed. She watched it breathe. Thought about the photographs. Thought about the tire tracks climbing out of the flood-cut hills like someone had gone in with a plan and come out lighter. That night, she drove north again. The storm had washed the land clean but left its scars behind, logs wedged against fence lines, feed troughs stranded in the middle of fields. At the tree line, where the tracks had turned around days ago, she walked until her boots sank in places the sun hadn't dried yet. And there, half buried near the edge of the clearing, she found it. A cage. Metal bars bent where the current had shoved it against a stump. Mud packed inside like concrete. Too small for livestock. Too heavy to carry far without a truck. She stood in the silence so long the wind moved through the pines twice before she finally backed away. The cage didn't belong to the flood. It belonged to someone who hadn't come back for it. Back at the clinic, the cub woke when she opened the door. It didn't startle. Didn't cry. Just lifted its head and stared at her like it already knew the world she had just walked through. That was the second twist. Because wild eyes shouldn't hold recognition like that. Marin cleaned the mud from her boots, wrote "found cage near North Ridge" in the logbook, and locked the door behind her though she never usually did. The cub slept again, chest rising and falling under the blanket she'd left. But her own sleep didn't come easy. She kept seeing the way the bars had twisted under the weight of water. And wondering how many more cages the flood had carried away. 2 days later, the call came from the sheriff's office. They'd traced the callers. Not through any official registry, there wasn't one. But through the leather itself. Custom work. Sold in bulk to a single buyer out of state 3 months ago. The same month several wildlife groups had reported missing animals near the Idaho border. Marin listened without speaking, the phone cold against her ear. When she hung up, the cub was watching her again from the corner of the enclosure. Silent. Still. Like it knew the storm had carried more than water into this valley. Like it had carried pieces of something darker, scattered them across the hills, left her to find them one by one. That night, she sat beside the pen longer than usual. The cub had started standing when she entered the room now, paws braced against the edge of the crate, ears tilted toward her steps. She reached in once, slow, palm open. It didn't back away this time. Didn't move at all until her fingers brushed the space just behind its ears where the fur grew thickest. Then it closed its eyes. Not from fear. From something else. The bond slid in quiet as breath, carrying weight she hadn't expected, the kind that made a person stay awake longer than they meant to because leaving felt like breaking a promise. By the time she turned off the lights, the questions felt heavier than the cage bars she'd found. Why collars? Why so young? Why here? And most of all, why did this one survive when the others hadn't? Because floods didn't choose. But someone had. By the 10th day, the cub moved through the clinic like it had been there for years. It climbed the crate without trembling now. Drank from the shallow dish without her help. Ate with the quiet focus of something rebuilding itself cell by cell. But it never stopped watching the door. Marin saw it each time she entered, the pause, the stillness, the way its head lifted like it expected someone else to come through behind her. That was the first twist. Because animals didn't expect unless the world had already taught them patterns. And whatever this cub had lived through before the flood carried it here, those patterns ran deeper than instinct. The sheriff called again. They'd traced the buyer. Private land, Idaho border, 30 miles of fence where no one had business keeping anything wilder than cattle. They'd go in next week with warrants. But next week was 7 days away. And 7 days was too long for someone who'd already abandoned cages when the storm blew through. That night, the cub wouldn't eat. It paced instead, slow circles along the edges of the enclosure, tail low, ears back. Marin knelt beside the pen, hand resting on the crate edge, waiting for the moment it would stop long enough to breathe. But it didn't stop. That was the second twist. Because wild things didn't pace unless something inside them remembered confinement. And the pacing told her more than the sheriff's folder full of photographs ever could. The storm had taken the cages but not the people who'd left them behind. Someone would come looking. She felt it the way animals felt pressure shifts before weather breaks. 2 nights later, headlights cut across the dirt road at the edge of her property. Too slow for passing traffic. Too late for neighbors. She turned off the clinic lights and stood at the window, breath held, watching the shape of a truck idle at the far fence line. 5 minutes. 10. Then it turned around. Didn't come closer. Didn't leave fast. Just turned, rolled back the way it had come, taillights disappearing into cottonwoods along the creek. By morning, she made the call. Not to the sheriff. Not to Fish and Wildlife. To a rehab facility 2 counties west with room for 1 orphaned bobcat and tighter security than a rural clinic with unlocked windows. Because the storm had carried more than debris into this valley, and whatever it left behind wasn't done moving yet. The van came at noon. White, no markings. Driver quiet. Papers signed on the hood of her truck while the cub sat in the crate beside her boots, watching with those same gold eyes that hadn't looked away from her since the flood. She didn't like transfers. Animals didn't either. But sometimes keeping something safe meant letting it go before the world noticed you were holding it. That was the sacrifice. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the weight of the crate as she lifted it into the van, the door closing, the engine starting while the cub stayed silent inside like it understood before she did that this was the only way forward. The deputy called that evening. The raid had moved early. Warrants signed, trucks gone in before dawn. They'd found cages. Dozens. Empty. The flood hadn't taken them all. But the animals were gone. Marin sat in the quiet clinic, phone on the counter, hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. The storm had ended days ago. But something bigger had broken loose when the floodwaters went down, and it wasn't done moving through the valley yet. That night, she drove out past the North Ridge again. The cage still lay where she'd found it, twisted against the stump, mud drying in the joints. But now boot prints ran through the clearing where there hadn't been any before. Fresh. Deep. Coming in. Turning back out. Like someone looking for something they'd lost. She stood there until the wind shifted and the cottonwoods began to move like water under the sky. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped. Not the wind. Not the deer that usually moved through here after dark. Heavier. Slower. She didn't turn around right away. Because some part of her already knew the flood hadn't washed everything downstream. Some things had climbed out when the water fell. And some of them were still here. The rehab center called 3 days later. The cub had settled in. Eating well. Gaining weight. Still quiet, they said, but alert, watching everything the way wild animals did when they hadn't yet decided whether the world was safe again. Marin wrote it down in the logbook, Case 47B transferred. Stable. Then she closed the book and sat there longer than the note required. Because the clinic felt too still without the sound of claws against crate wood. The sheriff's raid made the news for a single day. Illegal wildlife trafficking ring. Cross-state investigation. Arrests pending. But headlines didn't show the cages half-crushed by floodwater. Didn't show the tire tracks winding out of the valley before the warrants came through. Didn't show the animals that had already disappeared before anyone arrived with handcuffs and cameras. The storm had drowned the evidence it didn't scatter. And the rest had slipped out between the trees before the law ever caught up. Marin drove out to the North Ridge one last time. The cage still lay where she'd found it, half buried now in drying silt. Grass already pushing through the mud-packed floor. The flood had erased most of the boot prints. Only one track remained near the edge of the clearing, blurred at the heel, toe still sharp where it had sunk deepest. She stood over it a long time. Whoever it belonged to hadn't come back. Or maybe they had, just for something else. Back at the clinic, spring moved in quiet as breath. Windows open now. Air warmer. The sound of birds where there had been only wind through broken trees a week ago. But every so often, she caught herself turning toward the enclosure where the cub had been. Expecting the weight of gold eyes watching from the corner. Finding only the empty crate she hadn't moved yet. 2 weeks later, the rehab center sent a photograph. Not staged. Not posed. Just a moment someone had caught through the wire fence, the cub standing in sunlight, for grown thick again, had lifted toward some point beyond the trees like it remembered the shape of wild hills waiting on the other side. She printed it. Pinned it above the clinic desk where the tag and cut leather strap still lay in a plastic evidence bag. One life saved didn't balance what the flood had uncovered. But it was something. Late April, the sheriff stopped by on his way through town. Case closed, he said. Papers filed. Trafficking ring broken apart though not everyone caught. Some names still missing. Some trails washed out with the cages when the river ran through. He looked at the photograph on the wall but didn't say anything. Neither did she. The rehab center called again in early May. The cub had been released at dawn, 3 valleys west where the land ran wilder, higher, farther from roads and fences than where the storm had carried it in. No photo this time. No tracking collar either. Just a voice on the line saying it had vanished into the tree line without looking back. The way wild things were meant to. That evening, Marin drove north one last time. The flood scars had already started to green over. Cottonwoods leafing out along the creek beds. Fences mended. Grass pushing through places where mud had buried whole pastures weeks ago. At the North Ridge, the cage lay half swallowed by sunlight and new growth. She didn't touch it. Didn't move it. Some things stayed where the storm left them because digging too deep only turned up weight better left to weather and time. She stood there until the light thinned behind the hills. Until the wind moved through the cottonwoods the way water once had, carrying the same low hush across the valley floor. Back at the clinic, the photograph on the wall caught the last gold strip of sunset before the room went dark. A small shape in sunlight had lifted toward something just out of frame. Not tame. Not owned. Not saved in any way people kept score. Just free again. And sometimes that was the only ending the world gave you if you were lucky enough to get even that much. Because storms didn't care what they uncovered. But sometimes they left behind pieces you could carry forward. Even if all you carried was the memory of gold eyes watching from a corner while the wind moved through broken trees, waiting for a door you couldn't always keep closed.